Just three ordinary guys trying to understand the crazy world around them. We don't have all the answers, but we've got all the questions. You're listening to Just Add Bourbon with Jimmy, JD, and Brad. Welcome, everybody, to the Just Add Bourbon podcast. I'm Jimmy Don Kerr.
I'm Brad Broaddus.
And I'm J.D. Dameron.
And it is another beautiful Sunday evening here in the hills of Eastern Kentucky. And fellas, it's a monumental episode for us, number 50. Did you think we would make it here?
I had my doubts.
It's hard to believe that a year ago we started doing this. And I actually went back and listened to the first episode the other day. And man, we have come a long way.
Yeah. I remember the microphone being in the center of the room and all three of us talking in that one mic. You know?
Yeah. And one week you would be able to hear one of us. The next week it'd be the other one. It was crazy. So we got a real special guest for our 50th episode. And the man that you see on the screen, this is Dr. Alan Levinovitz. He is a professor at James Madison University and author of the book Natural. He works at the intersection of philosophy, religion, and science, focusing especially on how narratives and metaphors shape belief. A few weeks ago, he sat down with Joe Rogan on the Joe Rogan Experience for an epic 3-hour episode. Dr. Alan Levinovitz to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool, man. So, we always start these out, like I always tell everybody, just tell us a little bit about yourself, like your background, where you come from.
Sure. I grew up in Northern California in San Francisco Bay Area, and I went to college out there as well, went to Stanford. That's where I met my wife, who's from Kansas. And after college, we didn't really know what we were going to do. And she said, hey, why don't we go live in China for a couple of years? So that's what we did. That was a pretty crazy experience. Maybe a different podcast. I'll tell the story of how we worked in an abandoned theme park called America Land, which they had turned into. Oh no, I'm not kidding. They turned this theme park into a school. So the students lived in Mount Rushmore. There was a Washington Monument. All the administrative offices were in this replica White House. Totally crazy. Came back from there, did a grad school in Chicago, University of Chicago at the Divinity School, where I specialized in classical Chinese philosophy. So if you told me back then that I would have been on Joe Rogan talking about naturalness in mixed martial arts, I would have thought you were totally crazy. But, I was always interested in communicating with the broader public. And I always thought that academia should address real world issues. And so one of the things I noticed was that people would make decisions about food in ways that I could connect to what I had studied in religion. Most people who are familiar with religions know that, Jews don't eat pork or Muslims need to eat halal food. There's religious rules about what you can eat. And I noticed that people had the same strength of belief about what they should eat, even when they weren't religious. There were vegans, and there were pro-meat people, and there were anti-high carb. And so I thought to myself, yeah, geez, this looks like there's some similarities to religion. And so I ended up writing about the connection between religion and food in my first book, which is called The Gluten Lie and Other Myths About What You Eat, which really isn't about gluten. It's just about the ways we make decisions about what we're eating. And when I was writing that book, I noticed that people would use the word natural all the time. They say, I only want to eat what's natural. So vegetarians would say it's not natural to eat meat. And people who favorite eating meat would say it is natural to eat meat. And meanwhile, I'm wondering to myself, well, why does that matter? Well, who cares? Why does it matter if it's natural? Or a lot of things are natural that are bad. A lot of things are natural that are good. And that's what led me to start researching the meaning of this word that was so powerful, not just in food, but in everything. Who you should have sex with, what kind of economy you should have, what you should do with your kid when they're crying at night. All of these questions people would answer with natural. And that's how I ended up here today talking with you gentlemen about this book. So it's come a long way since ancient China, but I'll end this long story by saying one of the things I think is really interesting is the obsession with naturalness is not unique to modern humans communicating on Zoom who have been alienated from the natural world. Same exact conversations were going on 2,000 years ago in ancient China, where some people were saying, look, if you live in a cave and you only eat these berries, then you'll never get sick and you'll live forever. And it's these modern Chinese society, of course, is 2,000 years ago, that's causing all the illnesses. So it did loop back and connect with my own academic area.
So one of the things I started reading the book, and one of the things that, like, that word natural has such a different meaning to so many different people, because, you know, I read your chapter on childbirth already. And so, like, you know, a natural childbirth, you know, and people were talking about what the great experience that was. Well, that's not necessarily the truth, though, is it? Like, that's not necessarily a good thing, natural childbirth. You know, there's no, you wouldn't have made it through childbirth without C-sections and things like that, right?
That's exactly right. In fact, I just had a conversation. Funny you bring that up. I just had a conversation with a guy who said he and his wife, they thought about this, and at the last minute they decided, you know, they wanted a natural childbirth. I said, oh, you know, are you happy with that decision? She says, no, my wife hates. She says anyone who asks me, I advise them to get the epidural. And again, I don't, you know, I've talked to a lot of people about this, and some people are really happy with that decision. Some people aren't. For me, what I'm interested in, not telling who am I to tell people how to give birth. What I'm interested in is getting people to think, well, why is it that you want a natural birth? What is it that word means? What's special or valuable about naturalness that makes you want that, especially when, as you pointed out, obviously there's some obvious drawbacks to natural childbirth.
Brad? Well, I was just going to ask, you know, with this, the natural movement, there's a number of these movements that have almost become more rigid than most religions. And do you think that that's a thing just because of our tribal instincts, that people want so much to be on a team and be accepted? Because it's, you know, you see that in the fitness world now. It's like we can't do anything in moderation. It is either you get on the team and now you have to post 25 selfies a day. You see it with the natural, with the minimalist movement. Where do you think that's coming from?
I think it's a couple of things. The first is that, as I like to say, the sphere of religion's authority is shrinking. And what I mean by that is not that people don't care as much about religion. It's just that the areas in which religion is an authority are no longer, for example, food. You don't go to your rabbi or your priest to figure out why your stomach's upset. And you don't go to your pastor to figure out why you got sick. And this is actually a pretty recent change. You know, go back 500 years, and religion really was a place you would look to for guidance on everything from health to natural disasters. And so as the sphere of religion's authority shrinks, people still want the same kind of certainty and the same kind of reassurance that what they're doing is good with a capital G, even though they can't go to traditional religion anymore. So instead, you look to something like naturalness or your exercise regimen, your CrossFit regimen, whatever it is, your body fat percentage, and you use that as a substitute for not a tribal instinct. I don't think it's not the groups that drives this per se. I think it's the desire to be pure and clean. We all want to be good and not bad, and we all want to be clean and not unclean. And these are divisions that you find in virtually every religious tradition. And if you can't purify your food through a priest blessing it or through a rabbi saying it's kosher, well, you got to look somewhere else. And that's where I think naturalness is coming in. And in the same way you mentioned exercise, a lot of religious traditions emphasize self-denial, working yourself really hard, physical pain. You're going to renounce the world. You mentioned minimalism as well. So what I think you're seeing is these same kinds of religious themes: deny the body as a way of purifying your soul, but appearing in a context that isn't at least explicitly religious.
So we already brought up exercise. I'm going to explore that a little bit, because, you know, the Paleolithic man didn't run 5 miles a day. He didn't do 25 push-ups, and 50 sit-ups. And so what is natural for man? Like, can man even be in a natural state? Is it even possible? Is that even a thing?
There's something I talked about for a bit on Rogan, and I think it's really important to understand, because I went into this book, Natural, thinking I was going to debunk this, right? This is stupid. Oh, these people that do the paleo diet, what are they doing? It doesn't make any sense. But actually, I ended up changing my mind about some things. So there's something people call the environment of evolutionary adaptedness. And what that means basically is that we can say for any creature, including humans, that there was an environment that shaped our biology through evolution. So we adapted to a certain set of circumstances. I'll give you an example. There wasn't a lot of food around for a long time. And so what we evolved was a desire to consume calories when we encounter them, because in the future there might not be any. Now we don't live in that environment anymore, but we are saddled with that evolutionary tendency, which makes it difficult for us, some of us, at least me, not to eat more calories than we ought to. So in that sense, we can speak very generally of what is natural for humans or not natural for humans. That said, there are a lot of ways in which that environment was very different depending on your context. So the kind of food that you might have eaten depended completely on the geography in which the humans were evolving. It's not like the geography of the entire world was identical. And sometimes, Hadza hunter-gatherers, for example, sometimes they consume all of their calories in the form of honey. And then sometimes they don't. Sometimes you don't eat for 5 days, and sometimes you do. So it's true that there are some very general statements you can make about the environment we evolved in, but I think they are much more general than people would want you to believe. I'd add to that just because we've changed the environment doesn't mean that's a bad thing. So sure, there's more food around now. That also means not a lot of kids are dying of malnutrition. So there's some trade. We've improved some things. Do we have to add some social ritual? Do I have to tell myself more often than Paleolithic man not to keep eating? I do. Is that a trade-off for all of the delicious food and beer and bourbon that's in the world? Well, for me, I think it's a terrific trade-off. I'm very happy with it, and I would never go back.
So I was wanting to ask a question, and it was something I listened to you on Rogan, and then I came home and I watched this documentary on ESPN, and it was about Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. And the question of, natural and sports. And I know you talked about that on Rogan a lot when you were talking about jiu-jitsu, but I would argue that summer with Sosa and McGwire, that season saved Major League Baseball because they had been on a strike. But, today, and everybody was doing it. So, and that was considered unnatural because they broke all these records. I think you said there was a section in your book on sports. Is that something you found too in your research that, like Brad said, why do people hold to those things so tightly? Because, all they did, they took some, things that made them bigger, stronger, faster, and they destroyed a baseball for a year.
In the context of sports, one of the things that we're celebrating is the human body's ability to do incredible things. So let's imagine, for example, that Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa hadn't been juicing. And instead what they'd done, they'd altered their bats. And they put some kind of, I don't know, I'm not a physicist. They put some kind of spring inside their bats that was adding an average of 30 feet to the distance that they were able to hit the ball. We would all say, I think, I can't speak for all of you, but I'm talking about myself. We would say, well, that's not fair. And that's not what sports is about. We ought to subtract that distance because it was the bat doing it and not Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa. With performance enhancing drugs, there is a sense that those drugs are doing a similar kind of thing that springs in a bat might do. And so we would point at them and say, well, was it them, quote unquote, that did that was so great? Or was it this outside unnatural thing that was helping them? Now, the pushback on that, of course, is, well, people do unnatural stuff. You train. No, it is not natural to swing a baseball bat 1,000 times a day to train yourself to become a better hitter. And baseball bat design changes, and cleats change, and all of that changes. So it's imperfect. It's an imperfect model because sports are simultaneously natural and unnatural. That said, I get the pushback on performance enhancing drugs because at a certain point you have to draw a line and say, this is what we're going to allow in this particular sport, and beyond this, we're going to consider it not allowable. And that's what allows us as fans of sports to celebrate the human ability that's involved in a particular sport. So it's complicated, and I can imagine a future in which certain performance enhancing drugs are allowed. The same kind of debate happens. I don't know if you followed this with the swimsuits in the Olympics, where they had these new swimsuits and all of a sudden people were swimming much faster, these full body swimsuits, and then they banned them because and that's not even a drug, that's just a swimsuit. But it's the same idea at play. How do we balance wanting to celebrate the incredible things that a human body can do with also understanding that we are altering that body in various ways that aren't natural to the body?
All right. So this is a little more serious question. Like, you just mentioned about, the things the body is able to do. I hear that all the time, especially, we're in the middle of this pandemic and people are talking about, if we just give our body a chance to fight this thing off, maybe it'll do it. Our natural state is our body has an immune system to do these things. Have you ever encountered anybody, like, dude, you need to go to the doctor because your natural body isn't going to fight this thing off. Eating a cherry from the Amazon is not going to fix your cancer. Like that seems like it's become more of a prevalent problem as more people push for this natural kick, the organic kick, the vegetarians, whatever. Can you speak to that at all?
You hear a lot about natural healing, which goes back a fair way. You can trace it back, and I trace it in the book, back to the mid 19th century. This idea that, in fact, what's making us sick is artificial modern things, chemicals, which is a funny word, right? Because in certain ways, everything is a chemical. So what people mean by that is chemicals manufactured by humans. That's what's making us sick. And what we need to do is return to a natural state in order to feel better. I was very unsympathetic to that going into the book. And it still makes me sad when I hear about people who have opted, for example, for natural cancer therapy and ended up dying, or opted their children out of a particular approach. But I get where they're coming from now, and I'll tell you why. Because we think about the human body. There's a lot of ways we try to understand it. The human body is very complicated. The world's very complicated. So we're always trying to figure out ways to simplify this. How can I understand my relationship to the world, my relationship to the body, my relationship to sickness and health? Sometimes people talk about the earth as a body. And whatever your position on the extent of human damage to the world, it doesn't take a lot of thinking to look at a polluted river next to a factory and say to yourself, well, that looks lousy. What if that's what I'm doing to my body? And what if the factory represents artificial things in general? What if that factory is a pharmaceutical company? Now let's throw into the mix the fact that if I don't trust pharmaceutical companies. There's this opioid thing going on. These people want to make billions of dollars. If someone looks at all of that and they're scared and they're trying to figure out a way to feel in control and they don't know what's going on with their body, I understand exactly where they're coming from if they're going to turn away from all of that and try to come up with a new system for keeping themselves healthy. Do I endorse it? I don't endorse it. I think that's a bad idea. I think you ought to go to the hospital. I think Christian Scientists, for example, who adhere strictly to only looking to divine healing, which interestingly, Christian Scientists use the word natural a lot. So for them, as for many religions, God and nature are in certain ways interchangeable. So they say things like, you shouldn't seek to do anything other than look to nature and God to heal you. I understand where people are coming from when it comes to that. And I really discourage a lot of the scientists and doctors who I interact with from laughing at those people or saying they're stupid or poo-pooing that. I get it, and I'm sympathetic.
So the subtitle in your book is How Faith in Nature's Goodness Leads to Harmful Fads, Unjust Laws, and Flawed Science. So, like, what would be like the flawed science, like behind, relying on that nature that we just talked about?
What happens when you assume that natural is good in the scientific community, let's say, is, and I should pause here and note, people seem to think science is this thing that is done by robots, but science is not done by robots. Science is done by human beings. Scientists, like any human beings, have biases. If a scientist is a vegan, they're going to go into their study of veganism with some bias, in the same way that money can bias someone. Ideology can bias people too. We understand this in every other area of human activity. We understand that our religion can bias us and our political position can bias us. What happens in science too? So if you assume as a scientist that what's natural is good, then let's say you do a study on breastfeeding.
Sure.
It is likely that you are going to overstate the benefits of breastfeeding. And it is likely that you are going to overstate the harms of not breastfeeding. And what I have found, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to push back on this. I joke that I got out of religion because I didn't want controversy. And then it turns out that actually talking about naturalness is where all the controversy really is. I said that on Rogan, but it's true. There's going to be a lot of people listening to this who are going to say, oh my God, I can't believe he's saying this. Breastfeeding is the best for your baby. Breast is best. If you don't breastfeed your child, all these calamities are going to happen. Well, at least a little bit of that, in my opinion, comes from a bias towards naturalness at the very beginning. So it can skew the science on a lot of different, that's not to say that breastfeeding isn't beneficial. It's not to say that maybe we don't do too many cesarean sections. All of those things may be true, but we want to be very careful that we're not going into these questions with the answers already decided in favor of what's natural.
Makes sense.
Yep. Brad?
No, I was just going to say, as human beings and having the ability to create, just with innovation, at what point does that actually become natural, taking things to the next level? Should we necessarily do it like the cavemen did it? Well, when they invented the wheel, we ended up with cars. I think that's a good thing. So at some point, the evolution of innovation, you would think, would be considered natural.
Innovation is a natural human tendency. That said, I understand a definition of naturalness broadly that says what's natural is what hasn't been willed by human beings. So forms, my sort of formal definition is forms of organization that were not willed by human beings. Everything was natural before humans existed. You go back 1 million years, 2 million years, it was all natural. Now there are some things I think we can point at, cars, and say, well, that's less natural because it was willed and organized by humans than a tree, perhaps. Even if the tree was bred by humans, it's still, there were trees before humans existed, but there definitely weren't cars. The problem is that, as you pointed out, the further back you go, if you look at something like the wheel, or you look at the invention of fire, cooking food, natural ends up becoming synonymous with traditional or around for a long time. So you will see people saying that certain foods are natural beer, which you want to pause a second and say to yourself, well, beer is obviously not natural. It's just not a natural thing. Bourbon is not natural. I'm sure there's natural bourbons out there. I guarantee it, with natural on the label. That's ridiculous. But what people really mean is something that's been around for a long time. And again, I understand valuing that. Things are changing quickly. Sometimes new things are crappy. Sometimes they're made quickly for profit and they're mass produced. And so when people say, I like natural things, what they might really mean is something like, I like traditional things. Or I believe things that have been around for a long time are safer because they've passed the test of time. something like that. Again, my goal in the book is not to tell people what they should or shouldn't value, but just to get people to think a little bit more about what it is they are actually saying when they point at their beer or their wine. Natural wine is this huge new thing. They point at their wine and say, this wine is natural. What is it exactly that you mean by that, and why do you care? And once we can articulate that, once we can say that clearly, then we can have better conversations about whether or not natural wine really is better than unnatural wine.
So I want to speak to that for just 1 second. It seems like be all the rage right now, all natural, like this wine was all natural, by all natural ingredients. Or you'll see, instead of unnatural, you'll never see unnatural, you'll see artificial, which is like, I think it's the greatest marketing point in the whole world because who wants to buy anything that's unnatural, So they put the spin on it and it's artificial. So kind of speak to the marketing of this natural, I don't know, this craze that seems to be going on right now, and right now I guess organic seems to be the big thing, buying everything organic, which again goes to another question of is farming natural? Like we have our hand in it, but we're hunter gatherers, for years and millions of years. Okay, I'll shut up. Go ahead.
I love the word organic. I think organic's a great word for thinking about what we mean when we say these things. And I'm going to talk about something that's a bit different from food, but I'm going to bring it back to food. We don't just use the word organic when it comes to describing food. We actually use it in a lot of different contexts. One place we might use it is a political movement. So let's say there's a protest going on. Right. Someone might say, did this protest happen organically? Or was it artificially engineered by someone? And what we mean in that context is something like, was this the result of free and spontaneous human activity? Or was it orchestrated? Was it willed by a specific human being who was manipulating? Manipulate is another one of those words like artificial, which no one wants to say. Manipulation is always bad. Of course, all of this is all manipulated. Technology is just a form of manipulation. It is actually what makes us human, right? The word comes from our hands. Mani, that root that's what we do when we make things. We manipulate the world. The idea of organic being good is tied, at least as I understand it, to the idea of freedom being good and spontaneity being good. If something is spontaneous and it emerges freely, if the price of a good emerges organically, we're happy. But if the price of a good was fixed artificially, that's bad. Taking that back to food, when people say organic, they don't realize it, but they're bringing in all these associations. These good associations that come with the word and freedom and spontaneity. It emerged out of nature without any manipulation. And it's hard for us to see clearly exactly what we're doing when we label foods in that way. Sometimes organic foods are better if they're grown in a particular, if there's an organic food that's grown in a particular way in a particular context where there's soil runoff from too much nitrogen or, I don't know, whatever it happens to be, that may be good. But it's not good because it's organic. Right. Organic is a very vague word, like natural, that serves as a stamp of approval. It's in many ways no different from a kosher symbol on potato chips. It just doesn't look religious, but it's right there next to the kosher symbol. So that should remind people what kind of symbol all natural really is, or organic.
So it sounds like when you went in before this book, you wanted to go in and actually kind of debunk the natural thing. And somewhere in that process, you kind of ended up somewhere in the middle, which is respectable in this day and age, right? Yeah. Because it's like we have to marry at least, one side or the other. What were some of the things that you really didn't want to believe? Some of the things maybe you changed your mind on when you got started that maybe surprised you?
Big thing for me was that I now believe naturalness really is valuable in itself. When I say that, what I mean is again, with that definition of natural that I gave, not willed by humans, organized by some force that isn't humans. That's awe-inspiring and incredible. When we go out into the natural world, when you go on a hike, when you go bird watching, whatever it is, everyone's got some way in which they like to connect with nature. And the thing that's incredible about that connection, I couldn't deny it, is that what you're interacting with was created by forces that come from beyond and before human beings. It's absolutely nuts. It's a miracle. It is a miracle that all of these things exist without humans ever having shaped them. And whether you call that force God, or whether you call that force, as secular people will, nature, I see nothing wrong with being grateful for that force and valuing things just because they are a pure manifestation of that force. It makes sense to care about that. That's something I changed my mind on. And I stand by it. It's special when things are natural. What I still maintain is that that's not the only value. That's not the source of value. And sometimes, as I like to say, people prefer to camp where there's a toilet and electric lights. Other people don't. Other people like to go solo. Yeah, it's glamping, right? So I think it is okay to value what's natural just because it's natural. I think that makes sense. I think all of us, almost everyone, does it in some way or another. But it's not the ultimate value, and it's not the only value. It is not synonymous with holy or pure.
Someone asked this question. I don't believe I'll ask it right. So JD and Brad, I won't ask you to kind of help me phrase this, but how natural is it for humans to get their information from social media? Like, we get everything in clips, as we said, on a social media platform right now, doing an interview. Like, do you think that is an unnatural thing? You know, like to get all our information in little clips, you know, everywhere. Like, somebody could literally take this and make us say whatever we wanted. I'm looking to do that to JD pretty much every week, to put some kind of clip out. But like, what's your thought process on how social media affects us and how we get information?
Yeah, that's the right. You got there.
As you pointed out earlier, no one likes to say that something is unnatural. No company is going to put pure, totally unnatural. It sounds like you're saying it's gross or dirty or impure.
Sure.
The truth, though, is that this is unnatural. This is as unnatural as it gets. And you know what? That's okay. Books are also unnatural. You do not find little collections of squiggly symbols that represent ideas and stories out in nature. That's not a thing that exists. So the problems with social media, which there are many, are not because social media is unnatural. The problems with social media are because lots of things have problems. Social media is easily manipulated. It was designed in many ways to be compulsive. We haven't yet developed the proper rituals to govern ourselves on social media. What I'd want to caution people about then is to blame the problems that we have with social media on its unnaturalness. That's not the problem. There are good things about social media that are also a result of its unnaturalness. We can communicate instantaneously. People get to watch this stuff. You can find people that share your interests immediately. There's all sorts of wonderful unnatural things about social media, and there's all sorts of terrible unnatural things about social media. That's what I'm hoping to bring to people with this book, is the ability to look at that and then say to themselves, not reflexively, oh, it must be because it's unnatural. Back in the day, we didn't communicate like this. It was always face-to-face, and that was great. Well, I have news for you. Face-to-face communication wasn't always great. Face-to-face communication has some drawbacks. For one, you can only communicate with someone when they're near you. That's lousy if you're trying to find out whether someone down the river needs your extra fish that are otherwise going to rot. So there's all sorts of ways. Or if you've got an emergency, you need to get a hold of the doctor who's down the road. there's all sorts of problems with natural communication. That's what I want people to realize. When something's going wrong, don't just blame it on a departure from nature. That's easy and it makes sense, but it's not true. It's not accurate. And if we want to solve the problems that we face, that sort of reflex isn't helpful, I don't think.
Okay. So one of the things you said earlier was, this isn't a new thing. We've always wanted to find natural remedies and, and then wanted to eat natural foods, and nature was good. So what is it about us as humans that we're drawn to that? Like, what is that that's innate about humans that pulls us to want to eat natural or nature is good, or when obviously nature will kill us? Crocodiles are nature, but they'll eat you. Go ahead.
Most famous story in the world. There were a couple of humans in paradise. Everything was great. Everyone was immortal. And then what did they do? They went and ate the wrong food. It's funny. And that was knowledge. That was a tree of knowledge, of good and evil. And that caused them to fall.
It was also natural.
To take this back to the themes we've discussed, one of the punishments, if people remember, if you don't remember, go read your Bible, is one of the punishments was agriculture. Now man is going to be tasked with working the earth. And one of the other punishments was pain in childbirth. What does that tell us? Because this story repeats itself in other cultures as well. This idea that there was once a time in the past when everything was great, and then somebody violated a ritual or somebody broke some kind of law, and then we fell from nature into the modern world of pain and suffering. Well, if you look at the world, again, to bring us back to that miracle idea, the world's miraculous. The fact that we exist rather than not existing is something for which we should all be infinitely grateful. And there's no way, no matter how much science we have, when you look around at the world, there's no way we could possibly, as humans, do anything like this. So it makes sense that the forces that did that are good. If the forces that did that are good, then anything bad has to come from only one source. Us. Natural good, unnatural bad. Simple way of figuring out what's wrong with the world. It's unnatural human activities that departed from the kinds of activities that the forces that came before us wanted us to engage in. It's also reassuring because it means that we can get back to that time. We can get rid of suffering and pain if we just act in the ways that we are supposed to act and organize the world in the ways we are supposed to. So it not only explains suffering, but it lays out a blueprint for avoiding it.
Yeah, so I mean that reaches across political lines and religious lines, and yeah, okay. Pretty cool.
All of this stuff, what I think is great about this, and I hope people, maybe people won't think that when they read the book, but with the exception of one chapter, I don't think the book is political. Well, with no chapters are political, but with the exception of one chapter, I think people from every religion can read this book and think to themselves, gee, this makes sense. I can take something away from this for my own religion. The chapter that I'm referring to is a chapter on contraception. And I think that if you are a Catholic, you're gonna be somewhat upset with this chapter, in part because I use the history of Catholic attitudes towards contraception and the role of the idea of naturalness in that to show the ways in which it doesn't make a whole lot of sense as I understand those arguments. That said, there's a lot of debate within the Catholic Church about the meaning of naturalness. If nothing else, I think anyone, religious or not, whatever political party they happen to associate with, they can look at this word and say, I wasn't thinking hard about what this word means. And I wasn't thinking about its meaning in the context of my religion or in the context of my economic theories, natural markets better, or is it better to be communist because back in the day there was no such thing as an economy? Who knows? However people use natural to justify their economic position. It's a bipartisan, interreligious idea.
Yeah.
Cool. Brad, do you have any other questions?
No, I'm good.
So I got one, and I know you're short on time, but I do. I mean, I feel like I got to ask, how awesome was it to go on Rogan?
It was terrific. He is a very unusual interviewer in the sense that he's much more interested in having a conversation than just drilling down on one particular topic. So I really welcome the opportunity to explore a variety of topics. The other thing that was great about it for me is it's not often that you get to have a candid conversation. And I think Rogan, whatever people may think of the man, is an honest guy. He really is. He's honest and he's transparent. I think he is who he seems to be. That's the sense I got during the interview, which means that I got to talk with him about what it's like to be very powerful, a very powerful person communicating to millions of people.
Yeah.
And seeing that it's not easy, and hearing from him that he thinks about that's a responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility. And he's thinking about that when it comes to how he's communicating. That was a really amazing experience to be able to hear that straight from him. That room is also really cool. He's got a lot of cool stuff in there.
Now we're going to ask the serious question. Because Jimmy Don's been on the road here the last couple of weeks.
Oh, I have been on a roll. Yeah, no, we got to ask the doc. Absolutely. Come through, man. I'm telling you, whether
he's Team JD, man. I'm going to tell you right now.
He's not Team JD. He's Team Jimmy Don. It's just, all right, go ahead. Go ahead, JD.
This is pretty serious stuff. So you're at home with your wife on a Sunday evening, and on one channel you have The Little Mermaid, and on the other channel you have on Aladdin. Which one you watching?
Aladdin.
Completely unnatural.
I do right there.
Now, if my daughter has a say, that might change. I miss Robin Williams, man. That's basically what it comes down to.
Yeah. That guy
Aladdin's great. I was basically getting skunked like 0 to 12 Aladdin because I like Little Mermaid. And then all of a sudden I went on a roll of like 3 or 4 in a row where everybody that we had on was like, hey, how many? Was it just 2?
Yeah, I mean, I understand you felt like it was a lot, but it was
Well,
great.
it seemed like more. I don't know. It seemed like more.
I'm sorry to interrupt that roll.
Yeah, you broke my streak.
I have to be honest.
I'm mad at you, brother. Go ahead.
Doc, we really appreciate you coming on, man. I really enjoyed the conversation.
It was a pleasure. Those are great questions. I'm really glad and grateful to have the opportunity to discuss this sort of thing. And it means a lot that people care about learning these things and asking these questions. I'm really grateful to you all.
Before you go, you let everybody know, where they can find you at and stuff like that.
Where they get the book. Yeah, the whole deal.
Absolutely. You can find the book wherever books are sold. Natural. My last name is Levinovitz. It's totally phonetic, but if you're uncomfortable with it, if you just search Alan and Natural, my guess is it'll come up. I'm on Twitter pretty often at Alan Levinovitz. So if you want to follow me, come on out there. I'd really appreciate that. And we'll get to have conversations about this and all sorts of other cool ideas.
I bought it on Apple Books, by the way. It's on Apple Books. So if you like to read on your device, that's way I got it.
Perfect. Yeah, ebook as well. There's an audiobook version as well.
Cool. All right, guys, we appreciate y'all tuning in. We really appreciate Alan coming on, sitting down, having this conversation with us today on our 50th episode. It's hard to believe, JD and Brad, that we started this at a ball field, and now we're sitting here talking to a doctor about a book.
Baby.
Yeah. So anyway, for those of you all watching who want to check us out, we record every single Sunday. We do our normal episode like this, and then on Thursday nights we do the other side of the glass.
We also got another big guest next week, man.
Oh, do we?
Your boy, I told you.
Oh, is he coming on?
Yeah.
All right, we'll let Eric announce that this week. All right, so you can check us out on iTunes, Spotify. Of course, we launched from Podbean, YouTube, all the social media channels. And as we always end our show, no matter how bad your week's been, no matter how bad your day's going, if you just add bourbon, it always gets a little bit better. Thanks for watching, guys.